Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've been with us, you know our mission this season is really unpacking Joseph Schumpeter's 1942 masterwork, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy.
Yeah, and it's quite a book.
Absolutely. Schumpeter wasn't just observing his world, he was trying to predict the structural collapse of capitalism. And not through failure, interestingly, but through its own overwhelming success.
That's the paradox he sets up.
Exactly. And to start that whole project, he knew he couldn't ignore the original, perhaps the most profound prophet of capitalism's demise, Karl Marx.
That's absolutely right. In our previous deep dive, we sort of positioned Schumpeter as this economist who was fundamentally interested in sociological dynamics, how structures and institutions evolve over time.
Right.
He's writing this in the thick of World War II, really assessing the viability of capitalism against, well, the rising tide of socialism. And he makes this quite controversial choice at the time.
To dedicate the whole first part to Marx.
The entire first part, the Marxian doctrine, just dissecting Marx. For Schumpeter, engaging with Marx wasn't really optional. It was like the necessary starting point for any serious analysis of systemic change.
And what immediately jumps out, I think, is the unique definition of greatness. Schumpeter applies to Marx. He's not talking about moral greatness or even political greatness in the usual sense.
No, it's about intellectual staying power, durability.
He frames Marx not as some static historical figure, but as this dynamic influence that, well, you just can't kill off.
It's a really remarkable claim about intellectual vitality, isn't it? Schumpeter says that great intellectual contributions suffer eclipses, but they come back again.
And they come back not as unrecognizable elements of a cultural inheritance, but in their individual garb and with their personal scars. I love that phrasing.
Me too. It means the core ideas, the sort of intellectual DNA of Marxist thought, persist, even after being rejected or mocked or just temporarily forgotten.
That's so compelling, that idea. The influence comes back, still recognizable, still bearing the wounds of past defeats, as he puts it. It forces us to ask, though, why was Schumpeter even talking about a Marxian revival in the 1940s? Was it really happening?
Well, it was a very specific historical moment he was observing. He noted this surprising, almost counterintuitive Marxian revival happening in the United States, particularly in the 1920s and 30s.
In the U.S., really?
Yeah, America, which was famously resistant to European socialist traditions, right?
Oh.
Suddenly, it was seeing this rapid uptake of Marxist ideas among intellectuals.
That's fascinating context, because while this was happening stateside, Schumpeter saw almost the opposite trend back in Europe, especially in Germany, which you'd think would be Marx's stronghold.
Precisely. Germany had this long, strong Marxian tradition. But by the mid-20th century, Schumpeter noted that socialist leaders there, even ones considered quite radical, were engaging in a pretty conventional, almost bourgeois, non-Marxist economic reasoning.
So they paid lip service, but didn't use the theory.
Kind of. He said they were worshiping the deity, but took good care to keep it at a distance and to reason in economic matters exactly like other economists. Basically, they'd moved beyond the technical mechanics of capital, recognizing its theoretical flaws, while many American intellectuals were just discovering the sheer power of Marx the prophet.
Okay, so Schumpeter's task in this first part is to be the honest broker, maybe? The surgeon who cuts Marx open to separate the profound insights from the functional errors.
Exactly. He divides Marx into these four roles: prophet, sociologist, economist, and teacher.
It feels like a surgical approach designed for salvage, right?
It really is. Schumpeter's goal is to extract the important and stimulating truth from what he openly calls the hopeless wreckage of the economic mechanics. He believes Marx's profound vision of historical dynamics can only really be understood if we first acknowledge and then discard the failed theoretical proofs.
Okay, let's dive into the first piece then. Marx the Prophet, Chapter 1. The most arresting claim Schumpeter makes right off the bat is that Marxism is a religion.
Yeah, that hits you immediately.
And when you first read that, it kind of seems like a rhetorical cheap shot, maybe. But Schumpeter actually elevates the term, doesn't he? He argues it fulfills a necessary spiritual or societal role.
He does. He's using religion in a very specific sociological sense, defining it by its function in society. For Schumpeter, Marxism succeeds because it addresses these profound extra-rational cravings that traditional religion once satisfied, but which were, rapidly receding in the materialistic 19th and early 20th centuries.
So what specifically are the components of this Marxist religion, according to Schumpeter?
He identifies two crucial elements. First, it offers a system of ultimate ends that embody the meaning of life and are absolute standards by which to judge events and actions. So it tells you what's right, what's wrong, why you're here, the big questions.
Okay, a framework for meaning.
Right. And second, and this is really crucial, it provides a guide to those ends, which implies a plan of salvation and the indication of the evil from which mankind is to be saved.
A plan of salvation.
Yes, but here's the key twist. Marx offered a terrestrial paradise, salvation on this side of the grave, not in some afterlife.
Ah, okay. So the success isn't really about scientific rigor in this view. It's about providing meaning and, crucially, a sense of inevitable historical victory.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Schumpeter is pretty dismissive of the idea that Marx's success was purely down to scientific achievement, even if, hypothetically, that achievement had been more perfect.
He even downplays the rhetoric, doesn't he?
He does. He argues its reach wasn't even primarily due to the white-hot phrases it provided for social conflict, although he admits those certainly played a minor part in, galvanizing followers.
So if it wasn't the science and it wasn't just the slogans, what was the actual secret sauce? How did Marx manage to sell this, well, religious vision to the increasingly rationalistic and positivistic mind of his era?
That, according to Schumpeter, was Marx's genius as a political philosopher and maybe a rhetorician. He understood that in an age dominated by mechanistic materialism and the growing prestige of science.
An age where traditional faith was really on the defensive.
Exactly. In that age, you couldn't just preach openly, you had to dress the sermon up. Schumpeter says Marx was preaching in the garb of analysis and analyzing with a view to heartfelt needs.
So he essentially used the language and the structure of a scientific treatise, Capital being the prime example, to cloak this religious promise of a better future, a guaranteed victory.
Precisely. And that combination, Schumpeter argues, conquered allegiance because it offered the supreme boon, the conviction that what the believer stands for can never be defeated, but must conquer victoriously in the end.
That belief in inevitable victory.
Rooted in what looks like rigorous scientific proof that's the core source of Marxism's power and its durability, in Schumpeter's view.
But this religious critique doesn't stop Schumpeter from admiring Marx's intellectual breadth, does it? He points to Marx's surprisingly sophisticated historical understanding of the very system he wanted to destroy.
That's one of the most surprising elements, I think, especially for listeners who might only know Marx through simplified political slogans. Schumpeter praises Marx's ability to understand a civilization and the relatively absolute value of its values, however far removed from it he may have felt himself to be.
He respected capitalism as a necessary historical stage.
He did. And the most stunning evidence for this, which Schumpeter always highlights, is found right in the most radical text Marx ever wrote. The Communist Manifesto.
Right, that famous passage.
Schumpeter uses that quote again and again to establish that Marx had a kind of intellectual honesty that transcended mere partisanship. He cites the manifesto's description of capitalism's achievements. The bourgeoisie has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about.
It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals.
The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. I mean, that's quite an endorsement from the system's greatest critic.
It really is profound admiration for the sheer dynamism and achievement of the capitalist system. But hang on, is Schumpeter arguing that Marx genuinely admired this, or just that he recognized it as a necessary, historically superior stage, like something that had to be completed before true socialism could emerge?
Schumpeter seems to believe it's a bit of both. Marx definitely recognized the historical necessity, the organic logic of things, as Schumpeter puts it. And this perspective, this intellectual distance, prevented the unhealthy and stupid hatred found in some later, perhaps less sophisticated, revolutionaries.
Okay.
Marx understood that capitalism had a necessary function in human history. It created the productive capacity required for socialism to even be possible. It wasn't just some evil to be defeated immediately. It was a structure whose historical work had to be done first.
And that's the intellectual broad-mindedness Schumpeter respects.
Yes, and it's something Schumpeter clearly carries forward into his own theory of creative destruction later in the book. That sense of respecting the power of the system, even as you analyze its potential downfall.
Okay, let's move on then. From the passion of Marx the prophet, we enter the supposed rigor of Marx the sociologist in Chapter 2. Schumpeter starts this section with a kind of amputation, doesn't he? Basically telling Marxist philosophers that he's setting the whole Hegelian philosophical background aside. why does he feel that's necessary?
Well, it's crucial for his project because Marx did start as a speculative philosopher, deeply influenced by Hegel. But Schumpeter insists that to evaluate Marx scientifically, which is his aim, we have to assess his propositions based on social fact, not on abstract philosophic principles.
So ground it in observable reality.
Right. Schumpeter argues that in his mature work, Marx nowhere did he betray positive science to metaphysics. He thinks starting from the Hegelian dialectic just confuses the issue and, frankly, allows critics to easily dismiss Marx as a mere metaphysician.
Which Schumpeter believes undermines Marx's greatest achievement.
Exactly. He wants to rescue the sociology from the philosophy, in a way.
So if we discard the philosophy, what is that core sociological achievement, according to Schumpeter?
It is the economic interpretation of history, often abbreviated as EIH. Schumpeter calls it doubtless one of the greatest individual achievements of sociology to this day.
I praise indeed.
It is. He acknowledges Marx was bookish, maybe not an original empirical researcher, but argues he had a glance that pierced through the random irregularities of the surface down to the grandiose logic of things historical. He saw the big picture. He was one of the first to apply this systematic materialist logic to the whole sweep of human history.
Now, this is where we really need some clarification because EIH is so often misunderstood, isn't it? Even by people who claim to follow Marx. What does EIH not mean?
Right. Good point. It definitely does not mean that humans are primarily or only motivated by economic gain. Schumpeter dismisses that interpretation as piteously trivial. Marx was highly aware of non-economic motives, spiritual urges, artistic creation, ethical considerations, love, duty, all the things that drive human action. His contribution wasn't denying these motives existed. It was trying to unveil the underlying economic conditions that shape the context for those phenomena, the conditions that account for their rise and fall over history.
So economic conditions are the sort of bedrock, the prime movers. What role, then, do ideas, institutions, laws, religions, and beliefs play in this model?
Schumpeter frames them as transmission belts in the social engine. They are the prime movers themselves, but they are the vehicles through which these underlying economic realities manifest in culture and politics.
Ah, interesting.
Ideas translate the economic base into the social superstructure, if you like. Schumpeter even uses this point to sort of validate later sociological work. He notes how studies on the sociology of religion, like Max Weber's famous work on Protestantism and capitalism, actually fit perfectly into Marx's system, because Weber, too, was analyzing the economic structures underlying religious thought, even if he reached different conclusions about causality.
Okay, let's break down the EIH into Schumpeter's two main propositions. What's the first mechanical rule he identifies?
The first rule is basically structural determinism. The forms or conditions of production are the fundamental determinant of social structures, which in turn breed attitudes, actions, and civilizations. Put simply, the way we organize our technology and our productive processes dictates how our society is organized, what laws we have, even how we think our consciousness.
This is where that famous illustration comes in, isn't it? The hand mill creates feudal society, and the steam mill creates capitalist society.
Yes, exactly. And Schumpeter points out this perhaps stresses the technological element to a dangerous extent, making it sound a bit too deterministic. But the core takeaway is crucial. Our daily work molds our minds.
How so?
Well, if you spend your days working in a tightly integrated factory-based system, your mind and your social outlook are going to be fundamentally different than if you're working a largely self-sufficient feudal plot of land. Your location in the productive process shapes your worldview.
Makes sense. And the second proposition, that deals with the engine of historical change itself.
Right. It asserts this internal self-generating logic. Forms of production, he argues, change according to necessities inherent in them, so as to produce their successors merely by their own working.
So change comes from within the system itself.
Yes. The handmill system, by its own inherent logic and contradictions, maybe inefficiencies, maybe potential for new scales, eventually creates the conditions and the necessity for adopting the steam mill system. Change is endogenous. It doesn't require some external push or brilliant idea from outside the system. It just works itself out, almost like a chemical reaction over time.
Schumpeter is clearly impressed by this framework, calling EIH a valuable working hypothesis. But then he identifies two, well, pretty fatal critiques. What's the first problem he sees?
The first major problem is historical persistence, or inertia. Schumpeter argues that EIH seriously underestimates how sticky institutions and social structures are. He uses this great phrase. Social structures, types, and attitudes are coins that do not readily melt.
I like that. Coins that don't readily melt.
Yeah. Once formed, they persist, often for centuries, leading to social behavior that departs from what we should expect it to be if we try to infer it from the dominant forms of the productive process at that later time.
He gives the example of Sicilian social structures, right? Persisting long after the Norman conquest changed the formal ownership and maybe some production methods, the old ways linger.
Exactly. The institutions, the ways of thinking, the social relations, they remain, even if the underlying means of production have technically changed hands or evolved. The old institutional framework acts like a kind of ghost limb, influencing the present long after the specific economic structure that created it has vanished or transformed.
Okay, that's the persistence issue. What's the second, more ominous critique, as he calls it?
This concerns the need for auxiliary hypotheses.
Why is relying on auxiliary hypotheses so dangerous for a big theory like EIH?
Well, Schumpeter cites the example of the emergence of feudal landlordism among the Franks after the fall of Rome. He suggests this might be better explained by pre-existing military leadership structures and needs, rather than stemming directly from the immediate agricultural production conditions of the time.
So non-economic factors creeping in to explain a supposedly economic process.
Precisely. And if you have to keep inserting these auxiliary hypotheses, explaining the origins of power through military means or political conquest, or sheer luck, rather than strictly economic logic to make the theory fit the historical facts, Schumpeter warns that this is usually the beginning of the end of a theory.
Because it means the core mechanism isn't general enough.
Right. It means the core mechanism, in this case, the conditions of production determining everything else, isn't powerful or universal enough to explain the foundational historical events it purports to explain without needing these external patches.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's turn now to the other major part of Marx, the sociologist. The theory of social classes, epitomized, of course, by that incredibly famous line, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Schumpeter accepts the value of thinking in terms of class, but how does he critique Marx's specific definition of class?
Marx's definition is famously, almost brutally, narrow. It's purely economic and fundamentally binary. You have the owners of the means of production, the capitalists versus the non-owners, who only have their labor to sell the proletariat.
But that's it, just two main classes.
Pretty much. Intermediate groups, think small farmers, artisans, middle management professionals, are basically dismissed as temporary anomalies, historical leftovers destined to be squeezed out and pulled down into the proletariat, or occasionally rise into the bourgeoisie. Schumpeter argues this rigidity is just utterly unrealistic and prevents Marx from seeing the complex blurred lines and the significant middle strata that actually characterize modern industrial societies.
This very narrow binary definition makes the question of primitive accumulation absolutely critical, doesn't it? How did the capitalists get their initial capital in the first place to become owners? And this is where Schumpeter really throws down the gauntlet against Marx.
Oh, absolutely. Marx famously dismissed the standard explanation, the bourgeois nursery tale. He called it that capitalism arose from individuals with superior intelligence, energy, and crucially, a propensity to save.
And Schumpeter thinks Marx was wrong to dismiss it.
Schumpeter argues Marx was well advised to sneer at that story, because a guffaw is an excellent method of disposing of an uncomfortable truth. He basically says Marx laughed it off because it was inconvenient for his theory. Schumpeter insists that the nursery tale, while obviously simplistic, contains a fundamental truth about differentiation and enterprise.
Wait, are you saying Schumpeter actually argues that superior intelligence and energy do account for industrial success?
Yeah, he pretty much does. He argues that supernormal intelligence and energy account for industrial success in 9 cases out of 10. Now, that's a strong claim, maybe debatable.
Definitely debatable.
But that's his position. And regarding saving, while he agrees with Marx that ongoing accumulation primarily comes from plowing back profits, Schumpeter insists Marx missed the absolutely necessary function of initial saving.
What function is that?
It provides the would-be entrepreneur with the crucial breathing space. Time and resources needed to develop plans, secure initial cooperation from workers or suppliers, build the first machine, and, importantly, withstand early losses before the profits start rolling in. Without that initial buffer, which often comes from prior saving or inherited wealth, the enterprise can't even get off the ground.
Okay. Marx's counter-narrative to the nursery tale, of course, was that force, subjugation, enclosure of common lands, colonialism, outright robbery that was the true origin of capitalist power.
Right. Conquest and plunder. essentially. And Schumpeter poses what he sees as the critical, devastating question that Marx kind of skates over. Evidently, it does not solve the problem, which is to explain how some people acquired the power to subjugate and to rob in the first place.
Ah. If the ability to rob leads to control over the means of production, where did the initial power to rob successfully come from?
Exactly. How did some gain the strength, the organization, the weapons, the power to enforce that robbery and keep the proceeds? Schumpeter is essentially arguing that military or political power often precedes and creates the economic opportunity for large-scale accumulation through force, not necessarily the other way around, especially in that transition from feudalism.
So power leads to cannons, not cannons automatically generating power.
That's Schumpeter's counterformulation, yeah. He says it would be much truer to say that power leads to control over cannons than that control over cannons generates power. By pushing the origin of capitalist power back into the feudal era and just sort of treating the capitalist exploiter as merely replacing the feudal lord, Schumpeter thinks Marx vitiates the theory at both its historical and its logical source.
Because he fails to explain the new dynamics of specifically capitalist power acquisition within the supposedly new system.
Right. He doesn't adequately explain how the bourgeoisie itself gained the power to displace the old order and implement its own system of accumulation beyond just inheriting feudal methods of coercion.
Okay. And finally, on the class issue, Schumpeter critiques the necessary exaggeration of class antagonism in Marx's model.
Yes, this is fundamental. Marx needed the relationship between capital and labor to be inherently, irreconcilably antagonistic on principle. Why? Because class struggle was the main engine, the only purely internal self-generating driver in his whole system of social dynamics. Without that constant conflict, the historical motor stalls.
But Schumpeter counters that this just isn't empirically true most of the time.
He argues that in normal times, the day-to-day relationship between capitalists and workers is primarily one of cooperation. They might haggle over the division of the spoils, sure, but they fundamentally need each other to produce the wealth in the first place. Marx, Schumpeter claims, had no choice but to exaggerate the conflict and downplay the cooperation. Otherwise, the internal force driving his entire dynamic system would have fizzled out. #3, Marx the Economist.
All right, let's move into what might be the most technically challenging and certainly the most controversial section for many, Marx the Economist, Chapter 3. Schumpeter, again, grants Marx immense intellectual respect here, doesn't he? He calls him, first and foremost, a very learned man who really wrestled rigorously with economic facts and theory.
Absolutely. We have to emphasize, Schumpeter doesn't portray Marx as some kind of intellectual outsider throwing rocks. He stresses Marx was intensely schooled in the technique of theoretical analysis of his day.
A serious scholar.
A very serious scholar, a voracious reader who digested practically everything available. And critically, as Schumpeter repeatedly states, he was a pupil of Ricardo.
Why is that specific lineage, being a pupil of David Ricardo, so important for Schumpeter's analysis?
Because it frames Marx's entire economic project. It means Marx inherited Ricardo's theoretical tools, his assumptions, his way of looking at the economic world. Schumpeter argues that almost every theoretical problem presented itself to Marx primarily as a difficulty he encountered in his deep study of Ricardo.
So he wasn't working from a blank slate.
Not at all. He wasn't creating a completely new system of economic thought out of whole cloth. He was, in many ways, attempting to perfect, extend, and maybe radicalize the existing classical cost of production theory, particularly Ricardo's version of it.
And the absolute centerpiece of that classical Ricardian structure, which Marx adopted and made his own foundation, is the labor theory of value, the LTV.
The LTV is the cornerstone, absolutely. In its basic form, it states that the value of any reproducible commodity is determined by, or at least proportional to, the socially necessary quantity of labor required to produce it.
And Schumpeter's critique here is, well, it's not nuanced, is it? It's pretty final.
It's about as final as you can get. He declares the LTV fundamentally wrong, and for purposes of theoretical progress, effectively dead and buried.
Wow. Okay, why is his assessment so definitive? Why couldn't the LTV be salvaged or modified?
Because, Schumpeter argues, it's simply not general enough to function as a universal theory of economic value. It only really holds true under two incredibly restrictive and unrealistic conditions.
Oh, sure.
First, you need perfect competition everywhere. Okay, maybe you can sometimes assume that as a starting point. But second, and this is the killer, it only works if labor is the sole factor of production. or if capital and labor are always used in fixed proportions, and indeed, if all labor is entirely homogeneous, basically, interchangeable units of abstract effort.
Which is clearly not the case.
Not even close. The minute you introduce capital as an independent factor, different skill levels of labor that command different wages, land with varying fertility, or, as modern economics did soon after Marx, the crucial element of subjective demand, the idea of marginal utility, the whole LTV framework collapses as a general explanation prices.
Could you maybe give us an analogy to clarify the core difference between the LTV, focusing on labor input, and the modern marginal utility theory that Schumpeter champions?
Sure. Think of it like this. The LTV tries to determine the value of, say, a chair by calculating the hours of labor that went into chopping the wood, shaping it, assembling it, finishing it, basically, the cost on the input side, measured purely in labor time. Marginal utility theory, on the other hand, says the value of that chair is ultimately determined by how much a consumer desires that specific chair compared to other things they could spend their money on. It's about the satisfaction or utility they get from that particular chair, the marginal or additional benefit. It focuses on the demand side, the subjective evaluation by the user.
And Schumpeter believes the marginal utility approach is just better.
Vastly more general and empirically accurate, yes. Modern economics, building on the marginal revolution that happened partly during Marx's later life, has overwhelmingly shown that the consumer demand side, the marginal utility, is a much more robust and universal determinant of value and price formation in any complex economy with choices.
Okay. Now, this fundamental technical failure of the LTV, in Schumpeter's view, immediately leads to massive problems for the centerpiece of Marx's moral and economic argument, the theory of exploitation based on surplus value.
Exactly. Marx needed the LTD to work in order to prove scientifically that exploitation wasn't just accidental cheating by a few greedy capitalists, but was inherent and systemic to the wage-labor relationship itself.
He had to show the worker could be paid fairly according to the rules of the system, yet still be exploited.
Right. And this is where Marx made his really brilliant conceptual move, even if Schumpeter thinks it's ultimately flawed. He had to bridge that gap. He achieved this by introducing the specific concept of Arbeitskraft, usually translated as labor power, and treating that as the distinct commodity the worker sells.
Okay, so the worker isn't selling their actual completed labor, but their capacity to labor.
Precisely. Their potential for a day's work. And how is the value of this commodity, labor power, determined?
Under the LTV, it must be the labor time needed to produce it.
Exactly. So the value of labor power is determined by the labor hours necessary to produce and reproduce the laborer. That is, the labor time embedded in the food, clothing, shelter, and basic training needed to keep the worker alive and able to show up for work the next day. Basically, the subsistence level.
So the capitalist pays the full fair value of this commodity, Arbeitskraft, based on its cost of production and labor time.
Correct. The capitalist pays the worker, say, the value equivalent of 6 hours of labor, which is what's needed to sustain the worker.
Yeah.
But then
the capitalist, having bought the potential for the whole day, can make the worker actually work for, say, 10 or 12 hours.
Exactly. The worker has sold their potential, their labor power, for the full duration agreed upon, maybe a day. Let's use an analogy. Imagine the worker is like a rechargeable battery. The capitalist pays the full LTV price to purchase and recharge that battery each day, subsistence wage. Once purchased for the day, the capitalist can extract more actual energy, labor services, hours of work, from that battery than it went into recharging it.
And that difference, the extra hours of work extracted beyond what was paid for in the value of labor power.
That difference is the surplus value, or Mehrwert. It's appropriated by the capitalist, creating profit, all while strictly adhering to the LTV fair exchange principle, where commodities, including labor power, exchange at their values. It's exploitation built into the very logic of the system, not just cheating.
It is logically quite neat within the framework of the LTV, but Schumpeter identifies a core logical flaw, not in the surplus extraction part, but in applying the LTV to labor power itself as a commodity.
Yes, this is the killer objection for Schumpeter. It hinges on philosophical consistency. For the LTV to hold rigorously, the commodity in question must be produced according to rational cost calculations like any other manufactured good.
Okay.
So Schumpeter asks the crucial question. Are workmen, are human laborers, actually produced according to rational cost calculations? Since they are not, he concludes dryly, there is no warrant for assuming that the value of labor power will be proportional to the man-hours that enter into its production.
Because workers are human beings. their production, their birth, upbringing, education, their decision to enter the labor force. It's not a calculated economic input process driven solely by minimizing the labor time required, like manufacturing a shirt or a machine.
Precisely. Human life, reproduction, and skill development are influenced by a vast array of social, cultural, and personal factors, not just a rational calculus of the labor hours embodied in subsistence goods. By implicitly rejecting, or at least not relying on, something like Malthusian population theory, which did try to link population labor supply to subsistence costs, Marx removes an essential prop from his own theory of exploitation.
So if the value of labor power itself isn't actually determined by socially necessary labor time in the way the LTV requires,
Then the entire mechanism for proving non-cheating systemic exploitation based on the difference between the value of labor power and the value created by actual labor collapses. The foundation crumbles.
wow. So despite this pretty definitive demolition of Marx's stationary state economics, the LTV, the surplus value mechanism Schumpeter still finds genius in Marx the economist. How? By shifting focus entirely away from static value theory and onto dynamics.
This is absolutely the crux of Schumpeter's admiration, and it foreshadows his own later work. Marx, unlike most classical economists, was not primarily interested in finding some static equilibrium point. He saw capitalism as inherently dynamic, inherently unstable, a system of perpetual turmoil, the word Schumpeter loves, that could never truly rest. And that vision, Schumpeter believes, is profoundly true and is essentially the template for the economic theory of the future.
This dynamic vision leads directly to the compulsion to accumulate, doesn't it? That relentless drive for firms to reinvest profits to grow bigger.
Yes. Marx saw this compulsion clearly, rooting it primarily in the drive to extract more surplus value and survive competition. For Schumpeter, the driver is slightly different. It's driven by this incessant revolution from within the system.
Creative destruction.
His famous phrase, yes. Driven by the intrusion of new commodities or new methods of production or new commercial opportunities. The entrepreneur disrupts the existing equilibrium with an innovation.
And then every other firm is forced to adapt or die.
Exactly. Schumpeter actually quotes Marx here to emphasize this shared vision of dynamism. Economic progress in capitalist society means turmoil, and competition works in a manner completely different from the way it would work in a stationary process. To survive this turmoil, every firm is, in the end, compelled to follow suit, to invest in its turn, and in order to be able to do so, to plow back part of its profits, i.e. to accumulate.
So even if Marx's reason for accumulation, extracting ever more surplus value, is theoretically flawed, according to Schumpeter,
The fact that capitalism constantly generates these recurrent ways of temporary surplus gains over cost, which Schumpeter identifies as entrepreneurial profit from innovation, means Marx's prediction about the necessity of constant accumulation itself turns out to be correct, albeit for different underlying reasons.
and this relentless accumulation leads directly to another prediction, where Marx seems to have been absolutely right: the concentration of capital.
Yes, the theory of concentration, the inevitable rise of big business. Marx clearly saw this as an organic part of the process. Larger, more efficient capitals would inevitably beat smaller, less efficient ones, leading to an ever-increasing scale of enterprise and market dominance by fewer players.
He didn't see it as an accident or a correctable flaw, but inherent logic.
Right. It was part of the internal logic of continuous technological and organizational revolution within the mode of production itself. Schumpeter gives him full credit for foreseeing this fundamental trend.
Okay, but then we have to pivot and discuss perhaps the most famous failure among Marx's major economic predictions: the theory of increasing misery, or Verelendung.
Ah, yes. Schumpeter's pretty brutal here. He calls this prediction singularly infelicitous.
That's putting it mildly.
It really is. Marx clearly held, based on his analysis of surplus value and the industrial reserve army of the unemployed, that real wages and the general standard of life of the working masses would inevitably fall over time, or at best stagnate around subsistence level, due to the inherent logic of capitalism.
And history has just definitively proven this wrong, hasn't it?
Overwhelmingly so.
Yeah.
For all its problems and inequalities, the historical record shows that the standard of living for the broad mass of the population has risen dramatically, not fallen, in developed capitalist economies over the long run.
What about the Marxist attempt to kind of reinterpret Verelendung, to say Marx only meant the relative share of income going to labor would fall, not absolute living standards?
Schumpeter rejects that defensive maneuver on two main grounds. First, he argues it flies in the face of the clear, unambiguous meaning of most of Marx's own passages, which really did seem to anticipate absolute impoverishment or stagnation. Second, even if you generously grant the relative share interpretation, Schumpeter notes that, empirically, labor's share of national income has actually remained remarkably constant over long periods in many capitalist countries, contradicting even that weaker version of the theory.
So the analytical groundwork for the immiserization theory was just fundamentally flawed from the outset, leading to a bad prediction.
That's Schumpeter's conclusion. The theory didn't hold up.
Okay. But despite these significant theoretical failures on value, exploitation, and immiseration, Marx the economist somehow returns to the status of a giant in Schumpeter's eyes when they discuss business cycles.
Absolutely. This is another area where Schumpeter gives Marx enormous credit. He lauds Marx as arguably the first economist of top rank to really anticipate the later work of people like Clement Jogler by seeing that economic crises, panics, crashes, depressions were not just external isolated misfortunes like a bad harvest or a war or a speculative bubble popping.
But inherent parts of a cycle.
Yes, he saw them as mere incidents, albeit dramatic ones, within a recurring cyclical process that was inherent to the way capitalism invests, accumulates, and expands. Booms naturally contain the seeds of the subsequent bust.
So before Marx, economists mostly saw only the spectacular breakdowns, the crises themselves. Marx saw the underlying rhythm, the periodicity.
He connected the dots in a way few had before. While Schumpeter admits Marx didn't formalize a single, clean, unified theory of the business cycle, his writings contain dozens of observations and comments scattered throughout. The sheer insight shown in these fragments secures his high rank.
What kind of insight?
For example, Marx correctly pointed out the superficiality of blaming cycles purely on the expansion and contraction of credit. He saw that credit fluctuations were more often a symptom or an amplifying mechanism of the underlying industrial cycle of investment and production, not the ultimate cause itself. That was a deep insight for his time. #4. Marx the Teacher, Chapter 4.
Okay, so we arrive at the final persona, Marx the teacher. This is Chapter 4, where Schumpeter discusses the grand synthesis, how the prophet's vision, the sociologist's historical framework, and the economist's flawed mechanics are all fused together into a single, unified, all-encompassing explanatory system. Schumpeter actually admits this synthesis gives the analysis vitality, doesn't he?
He does. He says the ghostly concepts of pure economics, which can seem abstract and detached, are made to breathe in Marx's system. Everything becomes interconnected and congruent. Well, in the Marxian synthesis, economic distribution only really happens between clearly defined social classes, capitalists getting profit, workers getting wages. The economic concept of labor becomes synonymous with the sociological category of the proletariat. And all major institutional changes from wars and revolutions to new laws and government policies are explained within this singular schema of class struggle driven by economic imperatives.
That sounds incredibly powerful as a teaching tool, giving you one key to unlock everything.
Exactly. It creates this incredibly compelling, unified worldview. That's his power as a teaching doctrine.
But Schumpeter immediately points out the significant downside. The synthesis, while powerful, also creates new fetters. How does this forced unity, this congruence, end up obscuring important economic or social truths?
By forcing concepts into boxes where they don't always fit comfortably. For instance, Schumpeter points out that in standard non-Marxian economics, we recognize that all returns for personal service, whether it's a CEO's multi-million-dollar bonus or a janitor's hourly wage, partake of the general economic phenomenon of selling one's labor or service in a market.
There's a common economic principle at play, regardless of the social status.
Right. And understanding the general principle gives us great analytical clarity about how labor markets work across the board. But Marx's system, by rigidly tying the concepts of labor and wages exclusively to the industrial proletariat, the manual worker exploited in a factory setting, basically banishes that broader economic truth.
So the concepts gain political punch and vividness.
But they lose analytical efficiency and accuracy when trying to explain economic phenomena outside that very specific framework of industrial class conflict. The synthesis limits the scope of the individual tools.
Okay, let's talk specifically about the Marxian treatment of politics, where politics essentially becomes just another branch of economics determined by the base.
This is one of the most radical and distinctive claims of the synthesis. As we touched on, non-Marxian economists typically treat major institutional changes like wars, new legislation, revolutions, shifts in government policy as external data or shocks. They're things that happen outside the core economic model and impact it.
Right, exogenous shocks.
Exactly. But Marxian economics, in its pure form, attempts to treat these things not as external data, but as variables that are explained by the internal logic of class warfare, the dynamics of exploitation, and changes in the underlying capital structure.
Schumpeter really highlights this contrast, doesn't he? He says for the non-Marxian, politics is outside. For the Marxian, no politics itself is being determined by the structure and state of the economic process and becomes a conductor of effects as completely within the range of economic theory as any purchase or sale.
It's a breathtakingly ambitious claim. Politics is just economics conducted by other means, essentially. This holistic, materialist view is immensely appealing intellectually because it seems to offer this master key, this unified theory to unlock all of human history and current events through the lens of economic class struggle.
But Schumpeter sees a danger here, too.
He warns that if you relentlessly force all historical and political causality into this single mechanism of class struggle, it often devolves into triviality or crude reductionism. It risks missing the complexity of non-economic motivations, cultural factors, geopolitical accidents, or just plain political maneuvering that can drive events.
And the prime example he uses to illustrate the power, but also the potential pitfalls of this synthesis in action, is the neo-Marxist theory of imperialism. This was developed after Marx, right, by thinkers like Otto Bauer, Rudolf Hilferding, Rosa Luxemburg.
That's right. It emerged in the early 20th century, largely trying to explain the intense colonial expansion and the rising tensions that led to World War I, framing it all as the necessary final stage of capitalism.
What was their core argument, linking capitalism inevitably to imperialism?
It was a logical extension, they believed, of Marx's core ideas. The argument essentially goes like this. Because of the inherent tendencies towards competition, accumulation, and concentration within capitalist economies, the rate of profit for capitalists investing domestically inevitably tends to fall over time.
Okay, falling rate of profit at home.
So capital, under immense pressure from this falling rate of profit, is desperately forced to seek new, more profitable outlets elsewhere. Where does it look? To undeveloped pre-capitalist countries where labor is cheap, resources are untapped, exploitation can be more intense, and competition is low.
Which leads to capital export.
Massive capital export, yes. But investing in these often unstable or resistant territories requires political and military force. Hence, colonization, the establishment of protectorates, gunboat diplomacy, because all the major capitalist nations are facing the same pressure.
They inevitably clash with each other as they scramble for control over the same colonial territories.
Exactly. Leading inevitably to inter-imperialist wars, like World War I. It provides this seemingly perfect, internally consistent, purely economic explanation for the entire phenomena of modern imperialism and global conflict.
It sounds structurally very compelling, doesn't it? A neat package.
It is structurally beautiful as a theory. But Schumpeter, looking at it with his historical lens, proceeds to demolish it, primarily by examining the historical timeline.
How does the timeline undermine the theory?
Well, the neo-Marxist theory critically demands that imperialism be a feature of late, decaying, mature capitalism specifically, the stage characterized by massive industrial concentration and a severely declining domestic rate of profit. That's the trigger.
But the historical reality was quite different. Colonial expansion was already huge much earlier.
Precisely. Schumpeter points out, rather devastatingly, that the heroic time of colonial adventure, the peak era of carving up continents, was actually during the time of early and immature capitalism, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when industrial accumulation was often just beginning in Europe, and any systemic pressure from a falling rate of profit due to overaccumulation was conspicuous by its absence.
So the cause, late-stage crisis, came long after the effect, peak imperialism.
Largely, yes. He argues the chronology is just wrong. Moreover, he argues that much of this historical colonial expansion was driven by factors the theory ignores. Pre-capitalist aristocratic ambitions, dynastic rivalries, national glory, military strategy, religious motives, or even popular sentiment back home seeking adventure or escape from European problems.
Yeah.
It wasn't always, or even primarily, driven by the calculated class-conscious interests of big industrial capital seeking solely to offset falling profits.
And the theory also makes a mistake, Schumpeter argues, by assuming pure class antagonism back in the imperialist countries themselves.
Yes, that's the other angle. He argues that colonial expansion, particularly in the later period, was often actually an instance of class cooperation, not just conflict. The benefits of accessing cheaper raw materials, new markets for manufactured goods, and opportunities for emigration often translated into tangible gains for workers back home.
Like higher wages or cheaper goods.
Potentially, yes. He suggests it was often a movement toward higher wages as much as it was a movement toward higher profits. And in the long run, Schumpeter provocatively suggests access to colonial resources and markets probably benefited the proletariat more than it benefited the capitalist interest, relatively speaking. So once again, the synthesis. By forcing complex historical facts into the rigid mold of inevitable class antagonism driven solely by falling profits, becomes a liability, blinding its adherence to the more complicated reality.
Okay. This brings us then to the final great teaching, the ultimate prediction, the inevitable catastrophe, the breakdown, the Zusammenbruchs theory. So after all this analysis, does Schumpeter conclude that Marx did successfully prove that capitalism is doomed to break down?
For purely economic reasons, the answer Schumpeter gives is a clear no. Marx failed, in Schumpeter's assessment, to provide a rigorous, logically sound proof of the inevitable breakdown based solely on the internal economic contradictions of the system.
Primarily because the theories underpinning that prediction failed.
Yes. The failure of the Verlenden, increasing misery theory, was particularly critical. Without the ever-worsening condition of the proletariat leading to revolt, and without a clear mechanism for profits to vanish entirely, the purely economic case for an inevitable catastrophic collapse couldn't be validated. Even sympathetic Marxists like Hilferding later acknowledged this gap in the formal proof.
But, and this is a huge but, this leads to one of Schumpeter's most profound admissions, doesn't it? The real tribute he ultimately pays to Marx's foresight.
It really is. Despite the failure of the specific analytical proof, Schumpeter comes around to believing that Marx's core vision, the prediction that capitalist evolution will destroy the foundations of capitalist society, is nonetheless profound and fundamentally true.
Wow. So Marx got the right answer, but for the wrong reasons.
That's essentially Schumpeter's stunning conclusion. He credits Marx with having the genius to see the ultimate result of the long-run capitalist process, even if the specific mechanism Marx emphasized, i.e., purely economic failure leading to proletarian revolution, was flawed or incomplete.
So if it's not through purely economic collapse and revolution, how does Schumpeter understand this eventual destruction of the capitalist foundation? How does he think it will happen?
Well, here in part one, he only starts to hint at his own forthcoming sociological explanation, which he'll develop later in the book. But he does mention, as a contrasting view prevalent in his time, the perspective offered by his German contemporary, the economist and historian Gustav Schmoller.
And what was Schmoller's view?
Schmoller, coming from a more conservative, state-oriented tradition, visualized the process not as a violent bottom-up class revolution, but as a gradual top-down, progressive bureaucratization, nationalization, and so on, ending in state socialism.
So a slow, almost administrative evolution towards collective management, driven perhaps by the increasing scale and complexity of capitalism itself.
Exactly. It's essentially a non-Marxian, even conservative, reading of Marx's ultimate conclusion. Capitalism evolves itself out of existence, replaced by large-scale administration. Schumpeter brings this up to underscore his point. The structural truth of capitalism's potential self-destructive or self-transforming nature might be independent of Marx's specific political demands or his particular economic proofs. The system, Schumpeter will argue, eventually outgrows its own institutional framework because of its success, requiring new forms of management and social organization.
This whole dissection of Marx really forces us, the readers, and you, the listener, to confront some pretty deep, reflective questions, doesn't it? First off, is Schumpeter's Marx, this complex figure, part prophet, part sociologist, flawed economist, powerful teacher, still relevant for understanding capitalism today, especially maybe regarding the role of big business that Marx predicted?
Oh, I think hugely relevant, yes. Marx absolutely nailed the trend towards large-scale enterprise and market concentration, which Schumpeter fully acknowledged. Now, the core insight that Schumpeter himself salvaged and developed the dynamics of internal revolution through innovation, creative destruction that remains, I think, the absolute key to understanding modern market turmoil and technological change. It's arguably more relevant than Marx's original mechanism.
So Marx identified the trend, Schumpeter maybe better explain the engine.
Perhaps. Marx gave Schumpeter and us the language and the focus on dynamism, on constant change, even if the specific driver he identified, surplus value leading to misery and collapse, proved incorrect. He saw that big business would dominate. Even if he wrongly predicted it would quickly become a static fetter upon the mode of production, leading inevitably to mass misery. The dynamism continued, just not quite as Marx foresaw.
And the second big question for us, what does it mean for us today to try and read Marx through this kind of non-Marxist Schumpeterian lens, seeking structural truths rather than just ideological validation or rejection?
I think it means we have to engage with Marx seriously as a brilliant, pioneering historical sociologist and a profoundly insightful dynamic economist, not merely as the ideologue of communism. Schumpeter's method here is almost a pedagogical guide. Salvage the historical method, salvage the profound insights into how social systems change over long periods, the focus on endogenous transformation.
While being willing to critically examine and discard the faulty technical apparatus, like the labor theory of value, where it fails empirical or logical tests.
Exactly. Schumpeter views Marx as perhaps the first great economist to achieve a true chemical mixture, as he calls it, of abstract economic theory and concrete historical analysis, creating a histoire raisonnée, a reasoned history. Reading him this way forces us to grapple with the possibility of inescapable, slow-moving structural forces driving the evolution of our economic system, forces that might operate somewhat independently of our immediate political hopes or fears.
So the ultimate verdict from Schumpeter on Marx seems to be this complex, twofold judgment. Marx, the economic technician, is found seriously wanting in key areas.
Definitive.
But Marx, the visionary, the architect of a grand theory of historical dynamic processes, is deemed truly great, maybe even unsurpassed in that vision.
That sums it up perfectly. Schumpeter concludes that Marx was a technician with serious, even fatal errors in his core economic mechanics, but simultaneously a profound visionary who was the first to visualize what even at the present time is still the economic theory of the future.
The theory of the future being
Being the theory of the economic process as it goes on under its own steam in historic time. Not static equilibrium, but perpetual endogenous change.
And the final paradox Schumpeter leaves us with, the final thought for us to consider, concerns Marx's famous call for revolution. Schumpeter finds, ironically, a distinctly conservative implication hidden within Marx's deep structure.
It's perhaps the most provocative closing thought of Part 1. Marx's revolution, if you follow the structural logic that Schumpeter highlights, rather than just the political rhetoric, is one that really only comes, or can only come, in the fullness of time. It happens only after the process of capitalist evolution has done its complete, necessary historical work in developing the productive forces and transforming social structures.
So rushing it is pointless, maybe even counterproductive.
That's the implication. The Marxian vision, Schumpeter concludes, when it's stripped of phrases, actually carries a distinctly conservative implication. It suggests that fundamental social change, even apparently revolutionary change, is ultimately part of a slow, deep, almost inevitable structural logic that cannot necessarily be rushed or engineered purely by human will, political agitation, or conspiracy. Evolution has to pave the way.
A truly unsettling thought, perhaps. The man who inspired generations of revolutionaries across the globe might, at his core, have been arguing for the slow, grinding, impersonal logic of historical evolution all along.
It's a powerful rereading, isn't it?
It certainly is. And that profound structural logic, the force that operates under its own steam, is precisely what Schumpeter himself must now confront and explain on his own terms, using his own tools.
Exactly. So next time, we finally move entirely away from evaluating Marx and dive headfirst into the core question Schumpeter set out to answer in this book. Can capitalism survive?
Part 2.
Part 2. We'll get into Schumpeter's own truly revolutionary concept, creative destruction, and explore how he believed that constant internal turmoil works to both relentlessly create wealth and simultaneously undermine the very sociological foundations of the capitalist system from within. That sets the stage for his own surprising prediction about the likely evolution toward socialism.
Sounds fascinating. Join us then as we begin Part 2 of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.